Good morning, Blue Herons. Well, we made it to Monday. It's April 6th, and it is the first day of our second Oregon History and Geography block. So we are going to start this block kind of picking up where we left off and starting with some of the pioneer history of Southern Oregon. So today we're going to learn the story of the Applegate Trail. And some of you might already be a little bit familiar with the history, or you've at least been out to the Applegate, or some of us live in the Applegate. So let's see how much we'll learn from this story today. Well, our story begins many, many years ago in the 1840s, when the Oregon Trail was getting very busy with immigrants who were making their way out west for a new life. And there were three brothers and their families. And these brothers were Jesse, Charles, and Lindsay Applegate. And they came out from Missouri, like most people did, with their families and their children. And they made it all the way to Oregon. But this was during the earlier days of the trail, when, once you got into Oregon, if you wanted to keep going to Oregon City, you had to raft down the Columbia River with your wagon. And we know from reading across the wide and lonesome prairie that this could be really dangerous. And unfortunately, two of the children from the Applegate families drowned in the Columbia River on the way down to Oregon City. And this was really devastating to their family. And the brothers felt driven to find a safer way to get to Oregon. So, a few years later, in June of 1846, Jesse and Lindsay Applegate and a few of their friends met up in the small town of Dallas, Oregon, which is just a little bit north of Corvallis. And they began to blaze their trail. So their idea was that they would start in the Willamette Valley and they would go south all the way through southern Oregon and into northern California, and then they would cut east into Nevada, loop back up north, and meet back up with the Oregon Trail at Fort Hall, which is in Idaho. So they set off, and at first it wasn't too bad, because if you've ever driven up through Eugene and Corvallis, you know that the land there is pretty flat and pretty easy going. But once they got south of Eugene and the Willamette Valley ended, the land got a lot steeper and a lot more treacherous. And they had to go up and down through the passes, just like we do today when we're taking I-5. We have to get over Sexton Pass and we have to get over Canyon Creek Pass. And that was what they had to do, but in wagons. So it was very challenging for them to blaze this brand new trail through the wilderness. And then, of course, they got into the Rogue Valley, and things were better there. The land flattened out a little bit again, and they had to contend with Native Americans along the way. Of course, the Takelma tribe was mostly friendly with the settlers as long as they were respectful, and they were often very helpful to the Applegates and their friends. But in Northern California, there was the Modoc tribe, and the Modocs did not like settlers passing through their land, and they often made trouble for the wagons going through there. Another challenge that they had was water, because you think about Northern California and Nevada, it can get really dry there really quick. But fortunately, the route that the Applegates chose to take went around Goose Lake and Tule Lake, and there were a lot of springs and creeks and things that popped up along the way. So usually water wasn't too big of a problem as long as everybody planned ahead and was careful. In fact, later on, some of the settlers used to complain about how much water they had to cross on the Applegate Trail. But it was still a lot safer than taking a raft down the Columbia with your wagon. Well, by early August of 1846, they made it to Fort Hall. And Jesse Applegate went into the fort and he described to everybody in there about this new route that they had blazed from southern Oregon all the way back up and around to Idaho, and how it was a safer way to get to Oregon. Now, most of the immigrants on the trail still chose to take the Oregon Trail the rest of the way. And pretty soon, Samuel Barlow, if you remember, he was mentioned in our book too. Samuel Barlow had finished his pass, called the Barlow Pass, that went around Mount Hood and into Oregon City, and it cut out that extra danger of having to raft the Columbia. So it made the Oregon Trail a lot safer. However, there were still a few thousand immigrants who chose to take the Applegate Trail from Fort Hall south. And many of these people chose to do it just because they had heard about how beautiful and how wonderful Southern Oregon is, and how fertile the soil in the Rogue Valley was, and how perfect it was for farming. And they heard about our lovely sunny weather, and they thought it might be a nice place to settle down. So a lot of these families that came on the Applegate Trail are the families who founded our cities here in Southern Oregon. They founded Jacksonville and Ashland and Medford, Eagle Point. And the Applegate family became known as a very special family because they not only have the Applegate Trail named after them, but they also have a river, a valley, a mountain, and a town named after them. Now, after the trail was blazed, the brothers went off and they lived their own lives again. Jesse Applegate and his brother Charles moved north a little bit to the town of Yoncalla, which is a little bit south of Eugene. And they actually founded that town and named it, and they lived there with their families for the rest of their lives. Lindsay Applegate worked on the Klamath Indian Reservation. For several years, he was the Indian agent there. And then eventually he retired to Ashland and lived the rest of his life there. So the Applegate family thus became known as one of the most prominent immigrant families in Oregon. I hope you guys enjoyed this story. Feel free to discuss with your families. Email me with any questions during my office hours. Have a great day, and I'll see you again soon.